All right, so good morning, everyone. I decided to make a new note sheet with different problems than the notes from yesterday because I thought some of the problems in the notes just on yesterday's were pretty tough, especially when you're starting off. So I decided maybe a kind of like a fresh approach might help people that were struggling yesterday, or for those people that weren't here, if you were taking your PSAT. So the first kind of like what we're doing is basically we're going to be looking at um, solving polynomial equations that we wouldn't be able to solve with methods we saw earlier in this chapter. So we're trying to find like the zeros or the x-intercept. So I included like a picture of some of these graphs just so we can kind of visually see this as we're doing it. But I mean, like I said, this first example, like you might look at this and be like, oh, there's 4 pieces. Usually that means you should check. But if you look, you can't do the grouping method. Like if I pull out an x squared here, like there's nothing I can pull out of this one that would make these binomials like the same. Like, so you can't do grouping. So we need a new method. Basically though, when you factor, remember though, it's going to factor into things like this. So the idea is if I can figure out what one of these are, and I divide this by one of those factors, that will give me something left over that maybe I can turn into these. Like, so basically we're going to use division once we figure out one of our solutions to simplify our original problem to see, then can we factor it? So the question is, well, how do we get our first answer? Well, we're going to use our graphing calculator to kind of graph and find one of our zeros to start. So this is what our graph looks like. So like I said, we're going to see we are going to get these 3 answers. But I'm gonna pull up my graphing calculator really quick. Oops, wrong thing. Wrong thing. There it is. All right, so sorry, there's some issues with my iPad there. But the first thing we're gonna do is plot our graph. So remember, to graph, you press the y equals button in the top left. And our equation, I know you can't see it anymore, but our equation was x up to the 3rd plus 2x squared minus 5x and then minus 6. So if you want to graph that, you're going to see it makes this general shape. So you can even kind of use your cursor, like move your arrow. Like, I mean, on this, I can use my finger, but if you're on an actual graphing calculator, you have to use these left or right buttons, and you can kind of move it to kind of see where your x values are. You can't usually get it exactly where you want, but if you pay attention on the left, it looks like, oh, maybe it's at -1-ish. Maybe it's at like -3-ish. And it's at like 2-ish. You can't assume it's exactly from this. So we're actually going to use this table feature. So you press this second button, and then the graph button, you should say it says table above it, to see a table of values. And you're going to use this to find your x-intercepts. What you're going to be looking for is anywhere where your y value is 0. So if you see here and here, these are actually zeros, because remember, if you're graphing something, and I know that's a crappy sketch, but if you have a, like, say for example, this point, this is -2, 0. Anywhere you have a 0, it's going to be on your x-axis or one of your solutions. Sorry, I can't really write with this. You just need to find 1 on your table to get started. So I'm just going to use, I'll use -1, I guess. Why not? If you like positives, you could do 2, but I'm going to just do -1. So I'm going to go back to that note sheet. Sorry about that. And we're going to use synthetic division. Here, let me clear this annotation. Okay. So we're going to just have x equals -1. That's what we just saw from our table. We actually saw some other answers, but we'll find those when we do our next part. So we're going to do synthetic division. So we write our coefficients of our original. Remember, we bring down the first one, and then we multiply it by this solution. So -1 times 1 would be -1. Add that column, you get +1. Multiply it again, you also get -1. Add up that column, you get -6. -1 times -6 is +6. Add up this column, you get 0. You should always, always, always get a remainder of 0, because since you're finding a solution, that means it's going to divide into this function evenly. So remember, when you do synthetic division, your degrees all lower by 1. And now you want to see, is this something you can factor? If this isn't something you can factor, well, then you're going to want to double check your table, see if you can get another solution, so you can do the synthetic division one more time to see then if it can give you something you can simplify. But this is a quadratic, so we can definitely factor this either using, like we can solve this either using quadratic formula or hopefully one of our simpler methods. This one does factor nicely. It would just be x plus 3, x minus 2. So I mean, if you solve those binomials, you would just have -3 and you would have +2. And I mean, you can see in our graph, like, I mean, I included this graph, I mean, that this is where it crosses. One thing I do want to note, you might be like, well, why don't we just use the graph? Why don't I just graph these in Desmos? The problem with if you're doing that is you won't, one, if you have imaginary solutions, they're not going to show up on your graph. But the second thing is, I mean, Desmos is pretty good, but if you're using a graphing calculator, it's hard to see if what they exactly are, if they're decimals. But I mean, in Desmos, I know you can click on the x-intercepts and see the exact values. But the problem with Desmos even is if you have imaginary solutions, they're not going to pop up. So we have 3 answers. One thing we're going to talk about next week is, it's called the fundamental theorem of algebra. Basically, one tip is if you have a cubic function, you're going to have 3 answers. Like whatever your highest degree is, that's how many solutions you should have. But basically, this and if like what we just really figured out is that this factored, sorry, that would be +1, basically would be the reverse of what we just got for our solutions. Oops, that would be a -2. But the idea is basically if you take this function divided, but we basically took it divided by x plus 1, that gave us this. So like that's really what you're doing is once you find one of your solutions and you divide this function, it lets you simplify it to see then if you can solve what's left over. So that's kind of like the main idea with this. Let's look at another problem. And I also included the graph just so you could kind of see like we are finding these zeros. So like I said, the first thing we want to do is go to your graphing calculator and we want to just plot this. I will show you how to, like, you might be like, well, what if you didn't have a graphing calculator? How do you find one of your solutions? I will show you that at the end because you might be in a class someday where you need that. So I'm just going to graph the equation really quick. We have x up to the 4th plus 6x. Oops. Let me clear that, my bad. So sorry, we have x up to the 4th plus 6x to the 3rd. Oh, god dang it, wasn't looking. Here, let me just pause this. I'll type this in really quick. All right, so I got my equation plugged in, but you can see it's x to the 4th plus 6x cubed plus 8x squared minus 6x minus 9. So we're going to graph it. You can kind of see, like, I mean, like you can kind of use this to see where your zeros are. But like I said, you're not going to really be able to see the exact values using like your graphing feature on a graphing calculator, because on a graphing calculator too, you can't use, like, it doesn't have a touch screen, so you have to use these arrows, and you don't really have a lot of control over exactly where your dot goes. But you're going to do second table. One thing I should say with this table method, one, it's only going to show you integer answers. Like you're not going to see any decimals. So if your solutions weren't like whole numbers, this method really wouldn't work too well. So I'm going to, like I said, at the end of this video, I'm going to kind of show you how algebraically you could kind of figure it out. So just kind of keep that in mind. Your graphing calculator, like this is pretty much a good method as long as one of your answers is a whole number. But we see -3 is an answer, -1 would be an answer, 1 would be an answer, because see how like the 0 is for the y value. So you can use any one of these to start. I don't know if you have a, it really doesn't matter. I mean, you're going to get the same answers at the end. I'm going to do +1. Why not? So I'm going to do x equals 1. So I'm going to do my synthetic division. So that comes down, multiplied by 1, that would be 7. Oops. 15, 9. We get 0. Like I said, you should always get a remainder of 0. So this would be x cubed plus 7x squared plus 15x plus 9. And you should just check really quick. I mean, I'll kind of just let you know. You should see, if you get something like this, you might be able to do that grouping process. But if you look at this, I mean, just at a glance, there's nothing I'm going to be able to factor out of these two binomials that's going to give me the same thing. So if you tried to do the grouping method, you would kind of hit a wall. You wouldn't be able to complete it. So if you run into a situation like this, you need to do the synthetic division one more time. So we need to pull one more solution from our graph. So if you recall, -1 was also a solution, and -3 was also a solution. So I'm going to do -1. So we're going to do synthetic division with what I have. Oops, not the highlighter. And we're going to write the coefficients of what I just got. We're going to bring this down. Multiply this out. Like I said, you should always get 0 as your remainder. So I'm running a little out of space, but remember this, every degree goes down by 1. So that would be x squared plus 6x plus 9. This does factor nicely. You won't always be so fortunate. Sometimes you might have to do like quadratic formula or grouping or something like that. But you would see if you solve these, you're going to get x equals -3. And we had x equals -1. So just to kind of recall, like these were all our answers. Don't forget these answers when you're using them in your synthetic division. And notice we have a degree 4. And you might be like, well, there's only 3 answers. But keep in mind, this has a multiplicity of 2. So technically, that really counts as 2 of our answers. So like what I said before, that still applies. But, and you can see from our graph, like that's really what we found. We found where it crosses. But we're going to look at one of these problems on these notes. We're going to see we have imaginary solutions. So if you're looking just at a graph in Desmos, that's not going to be enough. You really do need to go through this process. But you can definitely use Desmos to check your real solutions. Like I said, if you look up a graph, you're not going to, if you have an answer with eyes in it, you're not going to see that. So that is one thing, like you do need to understand this process. So for these next 3 problems, I decided to pull problems from the Delta Math assignment. So you could kind of see how it's presented there just to make sure that's okay. You're going to see in Delta Math, they pretty much give you a cubic function, I believe, in every question. So you should only, like in that last example, we had to do synthetic division twice. You shouldn't have to do synthetic division twice in any of the problems in your Delta Math. But keep in mind that that's what if you run into a situation with what you get after your first synthetic division where you can't factor it or solve it, well, you need to do it again. So you're basically where you started with. So sometimes you get lucky, depending on what factors you pick, it might factor out nicely like that last one. Maybe if I picked one of my other zeros first, maybe it would have worked out better. But it's just how it goes sometimes. But in Delta Math, they basically tell you one of your solutions. So you actually don't need to use your graphing calculator in Delta Math, but they're basically telling you that x equals 1 is one of your solutions. So I'm going to kind of just bring that down here. That's what we're going to use in our synthetic division. I'm going to write the coefficients. And we're just going to do our synthetic division process really quick. Bring down the 1, add up the column, add up the column. But if you ever, like when you're doing this synthetic division to like solve these problems, if you ever get a remainder that's not 0, either you messed up your synthetic division or maybe the number you picked was wrong. If you're using your graphing calculator to get it, maybe you plugged in the equation wrong or something. So just kind of double check. But so this would be x squared minus 4x minus 32. And you want to see if you can factor that. If you can, awesome. You're good to go. If you can't, you're going to want to use quadratic formula. But in this level 1 section, most of them should, I mean, from what I've seen, everyone, it looks like they can factor out nicely. So what would multiply the negative 32 and add up to negative 4? Well, that would be x minus 8, x plus 4. So your other solutions would be x equals 8, x equals negative 4. And don't forget about the solution they gave you. So to put your answer in, you're going to have to click this plus button. So it like gives you more boxes. And then you would just put in your answers. So like 1, 8, and negative 4. Like use this plus button. I think if you're on a computer, you can put commas and it'll add boxes as well, but I'm not 100% sure about that. Let's look at one more. Let's look at one where when we do our synthetic division, we don't get something super nice to solve. So basically, they tell us one of our solutions that x equals 1. Just keep in mind, there's one other way they'll show it in Delta Math. They might write that one of your factors is like x plus 1. Like they might give you one of your factors. So that would really mean x equals negative 1. So if they give you like x plus something or x minus something, remember, you got to solve that to get your solution. So just be careful depending on how they present it. But for this one, we're going to do our synthetic division. So if we do this really quick. Like I said, you're always going to get 0 for your remainder. So if you ever get a situation where that's not true, well, something's off. So I kind of double check from the beginning just to see maybe you screwed something up. All right, but in this problem, and you're going to see this is from level 2, you're most, I mean, you might get lucky, but from what I've seen, pretty much all of them are not going to factor out nicely. So you're going to want to use quadratic formula. So like, remember, that's negative b. So that would be positive 12 plus or minus the square root of negative 12 squared minus 4 times our a times our c all over 2 times a. So I don't think of myself a ton of space. I'm going to start simplifying this. So this would be 12. The bottom would be 2. That would really be 144 minus 4 times 45. That would be 180. So I'm going to get a negative number. So this one's actually going to have imaginary solutions. So 144 minus 180, that would be a negative 36. Okay, here's the deal in Delta Math, though. You do need to simplify this as much as you can. So first off, that negative square root of 36 would be 6i. But even Delta Math won't take it like this. You do need to divide this out. So 12 divided by 2 is 6. And 6i divided by 2 would be 3i. So this is how you're actually going to need to type it into Delta Math. So that's like 2 solutions there. And don't forget about the solution they have. So like I said, click this plus button to get more than one box, but you would have 1. And then in your second box, you would put this 6 plus or minus 3i. And there's this plus or minus button right here.